Hello, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps good morning, wherever you might be joining us this today. Very, very excited to be back on this LinkedIn Live with all of you for the third time. Just very excited to be in the same company, same place, same time. Just expanding our conversation even further. So once again, welcome everybody. Just to make sure that we are not here alone and that everything is running smoothly, just drop us a hello in the chat. Let us know that you're here. As always, chat will be open and monitored throughout the session. And while we are going to be talking, we will be posing the same questions to all of you as well. So please engage with us. Let us know your reflections. If you have any questions, drop us in the chat because we would love to hear from you as well. Because again, we do appreciate that people are here out of curiosity, but there are a lot of people who are joining who are practitioners in the space of cultural intelligence, change management, and all the topics that we talk about. So we are as much here to talk about these topics and share some insights as much as to learn about the experiences from others. So yes, once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for being here. And yeah, drop us a hello in the chat. In the meantime, just quick rounds of introductions for those who might be joining us for the first time. Welcome. And those who are joining us repeatedly, welcome back. My name is Bai Bajega, and I'm a workplace culture strategist and a leadership coach. And it is my pleasure to be here this evening again with my lovely colleagues and friends and guests for this session, Dr. Sandra Upton and Csaba Toth. And I'll allow you both to do quick introductions as well. Sandra, would you like to begin?
I'd be happy to. Good to see you both. Sandra Upton here. I am joining in from the US, and I am the founder and chief DEI strategist with Upton Consulting Group, which is a firm, a boutique consulting firm headquartered in the US, but has the privilege of working with organizations all over the world, helping them to move their diversity, equity, and inclusion work forward in ways that are substantive and sustainable. Really excited about today's conversation.
It's turning into a habit slowly, no? We meet up every
Excellent. Thank you
week.
so
We
much.
talk about important things. So my name is Csaba. I'm based in the UK and I'm the founder of ICQ Global. And technically, we turn gut feelings into visible insights. And what I mean by that we measure, visualize, and optimize psychological safety, motivational drivers, and cognitive diversity, the three invisible forces that make or break a team. And the solutions have been used by hundreds of licensed partners in over 50 countries.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. Again, I think it's very evident that we are in a company of real practitioners, people who have been in the space of change management, culture intelligence, and leadership development, and kind of the topics that we're talking about for some time. So I'm certainly very excited to engage in this conversation, to learn from you, to gain new insights. And it is interesting that our conversation today is change management. We kind of started with cultural intelligence and we moved into psychological safety last time. And this time around, it's change management. And I think regardless of what we talk about, whatever programs or consulting work that we deliver into organizations, I don't think any of it is possible or sustainable without honoring the change process and the change kind of not just the process itself, but kind of like the ideology of change management as such. Because I think all of us, the three of us and also people who are here have all got some stories of change management programs or change management initiatives going well, but probably more often than not going horribly wrong. And the impacts of that are absolutely visible and palpable. And so just to kind of like set a little bit of context for our conversation today, change has become part of our everyday vernacular these days, whether it's expected or unexpected, as we have seen and experienced over the past few years. Change has left many companies out of business and others have come back stronger and more powerful. So there are many examples from the history, such as Kodak and Blockbuster and the Nokia case, where all of our favorite brands at a certain period of time in the history with significant success stories. Until, unfortunately, they doubled down on outdated business practices, business ideologies, sprinkled with some ego, and all this. That's the way we've always done it. And unfortunately, that has gone horribly wrong. So being prepared to not just survive change, but to proactively design it and leverage the opportunities that come with change is a real key skill in today's ever-evolving world. And I was, as I was kind of like thinking about this session today and preparing for it, I read a corporate longevity forecast that was done back in 2018. And there was a really interesting piece there that showed that back in 1964, from S&P 500, so some of the biggest and most valuable companies in the world, would stay on that S&P 500 list for an average of 33 years. That's back in the 60s. They would stay on that list for 33 years. That number shrunk to 24 years by 2016, and it is forecasted to shrink to just 12 years by 2027, which is, just around the corner. And in fact, another survey showed that 47% of the respondents of the survey said that they now feel that they must reinvent themselves in their business at least once every 3 years just to survive. So I think these are just a couple of examples to say that the future is not promised to anybody or for any business. And while there are tons of change management courses, certifications, and subsequently experts out there, 70% of all failed projects fail due to poor or non-existent change management practices. So that's a little bit of context for today's conversation, because I feel that at a time when change is the only constant, which is kind of something that everyone says, change management alone might not be enough. And so this also will be kind of like the central theme and central question for our conversation today. Is change management alone enough? And so before I guess we can talk about that, I would love to start our conversation exactly where we started every single time, just to kind of like setting the scene a little bit with the definitions and kind of like the terms that we're going to be talking about today, and specifically change management and change leadership, because the differences between these terms are more than just semantics. And so can you both elaborate on the differences between the change management and change leadership, and how do you feel these roles complement each other when it comes to driving organizational change? And if you don't mind, I'll pose that question first to Sandra, just because I think, Sandra, when it comes to change management, this is your professional and your academic background. So I would be very excited to hear from you first on this.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think it's a great question. And I think just to follow up before I answer that question, which I promise I will, but I think to follow up with something you just said, I think it's so powerful. We see the clear separation between those organizations who refuse to accept change or realize that change is a constant, and they tend to just get lost. Eventually they become non-existent. And then you have that community of organizations that do understand and say, okay, every 3 years, we have to reinvent ourselves. But I think there's still a gap between organizations who understand the importance of change and then how to actually facilitate that change. Right. And so I can understand and recognize that we definitely need to change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the skills or really understand what does that process look like. So I think there's still a lot of work with organizations in terms of closing that gap of understanding the need for it, but then actually knowing how to do it in a way so that they become part of that 30% of organizations that actually can create change that is substantive and sustainable and not be part of the 70% that have efforts that tend to fail. But I think the biggest difference when you talk about change management and then change leadership, and I'll start with change leadership, I think it's first a mindset. So again, part of that means understanding that your role is not just, when we think about leadership roles, it's not just the CEO or the director of department X, but you need to see yourself as a change leader and as a change agent. So you understand that your work as a leader is you've got a vision for your organization or a vision for your department, but you have to then understand that you are, if that vision is going to become a reality, or those goals that you've set are going to become a reality, you have to facilitate change. And so I think it's a mindset that I'm not just the CEO, but I'm also a change agent. And that is a big part of my role. So that mindset, I think, is the first step in terms of change leadership. And then I think once we get that mindset, then it's all about, developing a set of skills. It is a skill. It's not just a behavior. It's not just an attitude or just a mindset, but we have to take that mindset and translate that into developing skills. And I think it's a wide range of skills that are connected to that. But I think one of the significant skills is then understanding the change management process. And we know that as you mentioned, there are lots of resources out there, a lot of research that's been done around the change management process. But I think it's developing those skills to be able to walk your team, your organization through a proven change management process to create the kind of change that is going to ultimately change behaviors and change systems in the organization. So those are sort of the big picture definitions, right? Change management then is a process. It's a process that has what I consider non-negotiable steps that you have to take if, again, you're going to create change that is substantive and sustainable. So those are the big differences that I see between those two things. And the relationship between the two, to me, are then obvious, right? As a change leader, you need to see yourself that way. You then need to be able to understand that change management process and develop your skills to a point where you can facilitate that in a successful way.
Thank you for setting the tone for this. I can personally, agree more. I also think that when it comes to change management, I kind of see it much more kind of linear, more kind of systematic approach to a transition from a state A to B, and perhaps also smaller changes. When it comes to kind of, if I compare it to change leadership, I don't mean it's small, that every change is a small change, but just kind of thinking about change leadership, as you have already, alluded to, that it's more kind of about the mindset, about, how we see ourselves within that change process, and not just a change process as part of a project, but change process in a much more kind of pervasive manner. So yeah, I'm in alignment when it comes to definition with yours. What about you, Csaba? What's your view on this? You like to be controversial, so I'm looking forward to yours.
It's not exactly controversial, but your question just reminded me of a story that I read in a book, and it's seemingly unrelated, but it's not. And it was about an interview with a young girl who had terminal illness. And the reporter asked her, what does it feel like waking up every morning knowing that you can die anytime? And then the little girl replied, and she said, what does it feel like waking up every morning pretending that you cannot? So the reason why this question reminded me of this is because change is constant, like you said. So pretending that we don't have to manage change, we don't have to lead it, is kind of naive. It has not much to do with reality. So in a way, we can almost remove change from the definition, because you have to manage, you have to lead. Change is happening already. But in that case, I would also differentiate between change and transitioning, because change usually happens externally. We have to react. It's reactive. Transitioning is much more concrete, because this is where we start and this is where we want to get to. There is a pathway, that there is a roadmap, and that's more internal, much more intentional. And I think there's a big difference there. Because if you think about evolution, it sounds really empowering that, it's all about getting better and all those cute things. But no, evolution is really, really nasty, because evolution doesn't show you what works, but it takes out what doesn't. And technically, this is what you referred to in the very beginning, that if you don't evolve, if you don't innovate, then nature is going to take you out, because business just speeds up that process. And this is what we have to keep in mind. So it's, to me, the difference between change management and leadership is about tactical actions and strategic decisions. So it's not instead of. You need that vision, but you have to make it happen as well. You need that process. You have to implement it. Vision on its own, clarity on its own means nothing. You have to get there. So we need both.
Yeah.
Thank you for that storytelling.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
Sandra, please
was just
comment.
going to add, I do think it is, so again, all different perspectives here, which I absolutely love, but I think it's a combination of being reactive and proactive. So I agree 100% on the reactive piece in the sense that we're always, or should always be watching, right, what's happening in the internal and external environment. And so when we see things happening, we are reacting to those things. But I also think there's a part of change that does, if we are effective change leaders and we understand change management, I think there is a dynamic or part of the work that does require some strategic foresight. And so trying to forecast what we might anticipate, perhaps based on some data points that we have or past experiences, but to try to, we'll never know 100% what's coming. And even what might seem to be coming today might change tomorrow. So I get all of that. But I do think there is value in having some strategic foresight. So when we think about, and again, I think it's both sides. So I think about AI, right? And in some ways we are reacting. We all know that it's here and that it's not going to go away. And so we're reacting to that reality. But I think there's a part of, as again, if we see ourselves as change leaders, trying to say, what could that look like 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and how do we best position ourselves to be prepared for that ongoing change. So I think it's both in terms of how we see change and interact with it and develop our skill set around it.
I love that. And that actually, nicely alludes us into the next question, because I do want to talk about the skill set. But before I do that, I loved this quote from John Kotter, who's the kind of the founder of the 8 steps of, or 8 stages of change management. And about 15 years ago, he said that the biggest differentiator in the future, or the biggest challenge in the future, will be the change leadership. And the fact that almost nobody is very good at it makes it an even bigger deal. And so I think this very much kind of like speaks of what you, Sandra, was talking about just now as well, of that skill set, that, change is here. It always has been here. It needs to be managed. It needs to be led. There needs to be a mindset around it. We talk about it. We equip ourselves with qualifications around it, but not necessarily we are that great at it, especially when it comes to that, change leadership piece. So let's talk about the skills. What are the key competencies and skills that leaders need to develop to effectively foster cultures of adaptability, resilience, innovation, all the things that, unpin successful organizations, to not only navigate through periods of change, but really have this change mindset as part of their DNA? I'm curious. And Sandra, you were talking about skills, so you're welcome to pick it up from here.
Sure. Yeah. So speaking of Kotter, as you know, in my most recent book, I basically have adopted his framework because I think it is incredibly applicable to trying to create change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world. So I think and he is one of many, many researchers and scholars that have contributed to this work, Kurt Lewin and many other folks. But I think his framework is simple to understand, but it is a lot of work. So I always tell organizations, and leaders, you still have to do the work, but you're much better off understanding the key steps that are necessary to do the work, so that in the end you are actually experiencing impact and the kind of change that you are hoping for. But I think one of the first set of skills is just understanding those steps in the change management process. And I won't spend time going through, there are 8 of them, but I think they are, again, steps that are non-negotiable if we're going to create the kind of change that truly will impact behaviors and systems. And so I think understanding that when we create change, whatever that change initiative is, whether it's a massive transformation effort or perhaps the one that's more isolated to your team or your department, the 8 steps still apply to it. And ultimately, as you are facilitating that change process, understanding that if you're not creating change both at the individual behavior level and system level, then your impact is going to be limited. So I think that's the first foundational piece that you need to have in the set of skills in terms of understanding what those 8 steps are, and upskilling and educating yourself around that. And then I think the leadership piece is huge, right? So when we think about leadership, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in a leadership position, but if you are in a position of influence and you're trying to create change, then I think understanding the role of inclusive leadership, because a big part of the change process is getting other people to buy in to the change, to understand why the change is important, what their role is in the change. And that takes leadership. So that takes communicating with people and saying, here is what we're trying to do. Here's the vision. Here is how we plan to get there. Here's how you are going to be a part of that. That's a huge piece of it. So leadership in terms of getting buy-in, leadership in terms of helping understanding what skills your team members need in order to be a part of the change. And so upskilling them, or at least providing the resources and tools that they need in order to be effective in the change process. It also requires, again, really strong communication skills. And that ties, again, back to the whole vision piece. Whatever the vision is for the change, I see this so often in organizations where they want to create change, and it makes sense, but they've done an awful job of communicating the change. And so they don't understand why people are resisting and not buying in. So having strong communication skills, I think, is another important piece. And then I think another part of it is being able to create wins in the process. And that's like step 6 in the change management process. But I think it's an important piece, because anytime you are trying to create change, especially if it's a massive change and it's change that's going to take some time for us to see the big picture results, people need to see that the work is making a difference. They need to see that progress is being made. And so being able to identify wins early on in the process and facilitate those wins, and then be able to communicate those wins to the team, is a really important part of the process. So again, if I were to sum up what I just said, is understanding the change management process, understanding that your role as a leader is to facilitate change both at the behavior and systems level. Also understanding the importance of upskilling other people. So leading people through that change process, giving them the skills and resources and tools that they need. And then making sure that you're creating steps in the process that are demonstrating that the work is actually working, and that people can stay motivated and encouraged to continue on in the journey.
Excellent. Thank you. Csaba, what would you like to add to the skill sets and capabilities here?
Not to be controversial, but you know that I'm not a huge fan of the word change itself when it comes to, for example, coaching, because usually change means or implies that somebody is not good enough, and that's not very motivating. And sometimes people associate change with something bad. I'm not good enough. It's going to be a lot of hassle. It's going to be painful. It's going to be expensive. So when we talk about improving, developing, leveling up, then there's a level of continuity, which means that I'm good, but we can be even better. So technically, yes, we can achieve a lot by running away from danger, but we can achieve a lot by moving towards pleasure, a purpose, a clear goal. And maybe it's a combination of both, because unfortunately, running away from danger is a much stronger motivator than, running towards pleasure. That's just human nature. And it's really difficult to change our own habits, so it's even more difficult to change a company. But these are the main principles. It comes down to pain and pleasure principle, the carrot and the stick. And during our webinar, we talk about the two types of leaders. Most of them have common sense. They are the ones who are smart, logical, linear. They have their best practices. They assume that they are still the good ones. And if something doesn't work, they have to try harder. They rely on good intention. And they think that the future is just a slightly different version of the past. That's why they are linear. But then there's a new generation, and they have the uncommon mindset. They realize that new challenges require new solutions. They realize that you need people, because companies don't change, but people do. But they need a reason, and they also need the skills. You have to create the right environment. They have to understand why. We can force behavioral change, but that's not going to be sustainable. When you shift the mindset, behavior change is almost automatic, or at least it's easier. And I think that's really important as well. Because if we want to embed that kind of way of thinking, then we have to connect it to something more positive. So it's all about innovation, growing. Instead of shaming people into change, let's inspire them that, yes, we can get even better. But let's give them a reason. Show them how that serves the greater good, the goal beyond the goal, which is the purpose. That motivates people. So again, it's not instead of it, but I think packaging is important, and different languages or different packaging can resonate with different audiences. And as a leader, that's exactly what you have to find out: how to connect your message to other people's highest values and how to meet their needs. So if you can reframe that, then it becomes a bit easier. Not easy, but easier.
And I agree with what both of you have said, that communication is absolutely huge. You both alluded about visionaries, and I think if we talk about a real kind of like pervasive change leadership, that those people do need to be good visionaries for a number of reasons, and they also need to be great storytellers, or at least to have some kind of ability to storytell and bring people along. As Sandra also said earlier, it's not just about creating a strategy, some dark room behind closed doors away from everyone's gaze, but it is really about the ability to be transparent, to bring it out in the open, to invite collaboration and input, and have the ability to communicate it to a range of people. And I think this also is kind of like where that CQ or cultural intelligence piece comes in, because people are different. They have different cognitive processes when it comes to information intake and processing. They have different levels of agility and resilience when it comes to change. So again, the ability to effectively storytell and communicate to a more and more increasingly diverse people base, whether it's employees, whether it's customers or whatnot, is a huge challenge. And therefore, I think, it's so important to success. So communication is absolutely huge part of change management or leadership process, or both ultimately. The other thing for me also is that strategic planning piece, which I think, again, both of you have, alluded to and talked about. That again, we said that change leadership is pervasive, and therefore sometimes when you lift it up on that strategic level, it sometimes can become and seem a little bit more elusive. And And that's where it's important to also take some of those change management principles that, Sandra, you also were talking about, and lift it to that level as well. And especially lift it to that level, because if we are assuming that change management is more linear and the change leadership is more kind of like cyclical, that's where it's really important, because that also gives us the permission to, when we reach that end point, it also kind of like marks the beginning once again, when we recommit, when we assess how far have we come, how quality is that work that we have created. And that gives us the permission to go again, and to go again, and to go again. And that kind of like brings me to the third point. Apart from communication and strategic planning, is also sustaining energy in long term. Because again, in a world that thrives on an instant gratification, staying with long-term change initiatives is challenging, because the boredom, the distraction levels are, through the roof. People want to get quickly in, get things done quickly, and move on. But it is a different ball game, and it takes I feel takes skin, courage, and skill to really stay and stick with that change process again and again and again, not just one time. So those would be the kind of also the immediate things that I'm thinking about, and also just reflecting on what you both have been saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to build in those wins, and they don't have to be massive wins. I work with organizations, especially if they're early on in the journey around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's so much that needs to be done. Part of it is just sort of filtering through how do you even get started with the work? And it oftentimes requires just some really basic things, because they are just at the beginning of the process. And so, I will tell them that, in the first 6 months, you should show some kind of win. Now, let's say one of your issues is that you're not attracting diverse talent. And that's a big thing to figure out how do we address that. And so you might not be able to, in 6 months, say, we have now increased, the number of women or, people of color or people from the neurodiverse community by 50%. But you might be able to say, what we have done is we've completely revamped our process for how we source talent. And, now, before, we used to try all of these very traditional methods for recruiting diverse talent, but because they were traditional and it was all kinds of affinity, a bias built into it, we kept attracting the same people. But now we've completely revamped that system. That's a win, right? So we now have, we've completely turned upside down how we source. We don't just go to the same organizations or the same, places, but we now have a very diverse community of people that we've partnered with to attract. That's progress. Celebrate that. Make a big deal out of it. And then maybe perhaps another goal in the next couple of months is, now we're going to train all of the people that have a role in the hiring process, take them through unconscious bias training. So when they are doing these interviews and making decisions, that we're making sure that we're mitigating bias in the process. That's a major step and a major win. Now, there's more involved in terms of, managing and assessing whether or not those behaviors have changed, but there is that is progress. And so it's, sometimes when we think about progress and change, we want to have these massive, things that we report out on too soon. And we need to recognize that they can be small wins, but very important wins that continue to move you forward, and that keeps people motivated. And they say, okay, this is working and we are headed in the right direction. And so I still want to be a part of this work. So I think that's a really big piece of the process, is building in those wins early on, and then consistently keeping them built into the process and communicating them throughout the whole journey.
I think based on that, it's really important to measure the progress, like you said, and this is exactly what we can focus on. Because if we can see that within the company, psychological safety and motivation increased, and we can quantify that, that's fantastic. Because we have to create the right environment. Because if people try to increase diversity without inclusion, it often turns into painful liability. Let's be honest. So we have to make it work. Yeah, a lot of people refer to that McKinsey report that ethnically diverse companies are 35% more efficient than homogeneous ones. But that also explains that it's not causality, it's correlation. And knowing the research that the number one trait of high-performing teams is psychological safety, it's safe to assume that those companies are much more inclusive and psychologically safe. That's why they perform better, and that's why they attract more diversity as well. And that is, I think, the ideal combination. But it's not magic.
Absolutely.
You have a roadmap.
I think it takes cultural intelligence. Absolutely. I think those statistics are so misleading, as you said, Csaba. They put those out there, but they don't include what you just described, that they've put in the work to create the psychological safety. They put into work to make sure that leaders are culturally intelligent. 100%. I agree.
Based on this, do you think that there is a need for transitioning from change management to change leadership? And if so, what are the main challenges? What's your experience?
I think, again, when you talk about change leadership, I think there are a lot of leaders that don't understand what that means. I don't think that they see themselves that way, right? They see themselves as, leading a team of people, and they tend to do it in a way that is influenced by their own experiences and in a way that they think they lead from how they think other people. They lead from how they would want to be led versus leading in a culturally intelligent way. So I think they just don't understand that, again, as you're leading people and you're trying to create change, there is a science behind how that happens. So they don't see themselves as change leaders. They don't understand what it means. They don't understand the process. And again, they tend to lead from how they would typically want to be led, and they lack cultural intelligence. So I think those are the key challenges that continue to keep that separation from being able to create the kind of change that's necessary and that is sustainable.
Yes, I think, if I reflect on that and kind of like the key challenges, I think, well, first and foremost, you already said it, it's the mindset. I think that's kind of like the number one to where to begin. I think it is also important to understand that, change leadership is not even change management, but definitely change leadership is not a one person's game. The environment has a huge role to play as well, but it's not one person's game. Everyone has to be included, everyone has to be informed. I don't think I need to kind of like add much more to that. It's exactly what it kind of like says to the tin on the tin. Another thing that I kind of like think about as well is our ability to also move away from outdated practices and outdated ideologies. So for instance, best practices, this term has always given me a bit of an ick. I get it, it's I get the premise of it, I know like kind of like where it comes from, what's the purpose of it. However, in the change context, and especially the rapid change of which we are and the scale of the change in which we are in right now, today's best practices may no longer be tomorrow's best practices. And so there has to be a high level of agility built into those best practices if we have them. Because I also feel that, there always is much more that we learn from our mistakes and our failures. So we do have to, create systems where that is facilitated, where that is not punished, where that is taken into account, and that kind of like becomes the best practice, not kind of like all the time failing and making mistakes, but really integrating those as healthy practices within cultures. And another one, for those would be also, if it's not broken, then we don't need to fix it. No, go and fix it anyway. Because the fact that you potentially don't see that something is broken doesn't mean that it isn't. And I think we see that quite a lot in today's, workspace. And especially if we think about the DEI discourse, where there are, people who have never been part of our organization, demographics that have never been part of our organizations coming in and challenging our systems, challenging our best practices, challenging the ways that we work. But it's not broken, so we're not going to fix it. So, if we do talk about inclusion and diversity and representation, all of these things that we want part of our organization because we want higher growth, because we want more innovation and all of these things, then we do need to listen to our people and, again, create space where there are loops of feedback, and they are actioned, and they are transparent, and they are communicated. And so then we won't need to do these big change management programs for years, and most of them fail anyway, because when we do that on everyday basis, then that change doesn't feel as, or evolution, to use Chaba's term, it doesn't feel as scary then. As big, it doesn't feel as big, as scary, as meaty, as and all of those kinds of things, because that's again part of that change mindset that we were kind of like talking about earlier. And as I talk about it, and I'll vacate the floor in a second, I just want to put that question also to everybody who are here with us. What do you people, because I'm sure you have been through a change process, or maybe some of you have led it, do you feel?
Oh, I believe Baiba has frozen up on us, but I think she was asking the question.
Into leadership to hear from you. Oh, did you lose me?
For just a couple of seconds.
Okay. Well, I think
we got your statements out.
But we could hear the question.
Yeah,
and the audience could hear it as well.
We can hear the question.
So just an invitation for people to join our conversation as well, and let me know.
Yes,
I think my computer.
I think everybody heard it. One of the things I wanted to follow up on, I agree with you that we have to absolutely be agile, because things are changing all the time. So I do like the word change. I think it's all in how we frame it and how we approach people with it. I always talk, one of the questions that I get asked a lot in the DEI space is, how do I get my organization to understand the value of this when we're already successful, right? We're a $10 billion company. We're doing fine. Why do we need DEI, right? And so I always come at it from, imagine what you might be missing out on, right? Let's go from good to great. That's fantastic that you are doing well, but imagine how much better you could be doing, especially given the demographic shifts and all of the different consumers that you might be missing out on because you don't understand their needs and you're not marketing to them. So but it's all about potential and being better, not about attacking or shaming. But I do think I agree with you that we need to be agile throughout the entire process, and that that the process should be organic. But I do think that there is, when we talk about building our skills and seeing ourselves as change leaders, I do think there is tremendous value in some of the evidence-based processes that are out there that have been around for a very long time, that have been proven, right? So if you think about Kotter's model and you think about how I've married that to DEI, the first step in the process is this idea of getting buy-in. Now, I think that is a critical step in the process. I don't care how big or how small your change effort is. Now, what needs to be, so I think that is the best practice in terms of this idea of getting buy-in, but what that looks like in your organization might be very different than what it looks like in my organization. So you absolutely have to contextualize it and understand, because you may be at a different place. You may be at a place where you have done an awful job of getting buy-in. There's no trust. There's no psychological safety. So there's just a lot of really basic stuff that you've got to get done first. Whereas an organization that maybe has done a little bit more work and they do have that trust, there is that psychological safety, then they may have to do some different things to get the buy-in. And it may not take them as long to get it, to then be able to go to the next step. So I think the idea or that important step of buy-in is universal, and it is a best practice. But of course, what is different and what we need to be agile about is understanding how do we contextualize that to our current state and the conditions by which we are in that moment. So I think there's that balance of using a framework that's proven. So we know the steps that are necessary, but at each step in that process, we absolutely have to be flexible, and we have to contextualize it.
That was a really good point as well, that when you mentioned that what if a company is doing really well, then how do you motivate them?
I get that question all the time. Yeah.
That is one thing that they can imagine what else they could gain.
Yeah.
But it's enough if they look back at the past and they realize that blockbusters used to be huge, probably bigger than them. They gone.
Right.
And according to some sources, even the inventor of digital camera used to work for Kodak. And he brought up the idea there. And they said, nah, that's silly. We don't need that. We are comfortable. We are big. We are doing well. And now they're gone, pretty much. And that's the real danger. So the future is unpredictable. That's true. But history kind of repeats itself. And we can look back, and really big companies can disappear really quickly because they are much slower to change.
Yes, absolutely. Some, really, really important points made about kind of like the agility and the Kotter's, 8 steps or whatever change process. I think, those tools and those processes just help us to kind of understand where we are headed, and kind of like manage the process as well, because I don't think we can wing any change process. That's first and foremost. And secondly, change process is a long-term thing, and it's a big picture thing. And sometimes people change within the organization before the actual change takes place. And so when the next generation of leaders, come in, everything again gets, swept off the floor, and we start again. So we never kind of like get to go through the whole process. And so when the process and the practice and the mindset of change leadership is much more robust within these spaces, then we can also start seeing, that process happening rather than being like, oh, another one, leader creating change, another time we need to go through change. And every time it creates anxiety for people. And I think that is also, partially why our workplaces are such great sources of anxiety and burnout. And I'm, curious from both of you as well, as we are, again, slowly but very rapidly coming to an end of our session. We've shared, we've talked about skills, we've talked about challenges, we've really unpacked the differences between change management and change leadership, ways they overlap. But I'm very curious, can you share a specific example or a case study where effective change leadership has led to a successful organizational transformation, and whether you were part of it, whether you are leading it, whether you've witnessed it, and what are some of the key perhaps takeaways from that process that you can share with those who are here or watching us on replay?
I'll let Csaba go first. I feel like I've been talking a lot.
But that's your expertise, and that's the reason why I like your framework as well, because especially when we did the book launch, or we attended your book launch, and then you said there's these 8 steps. So you can ask the client, where are you now?
Right.
And that makes it much more visible, because it's like a series of short sprints, but it is cyclical. But if you cannot see where you are, it's very difficult to do it. It's very difficult to stay motivated.
Absolutely.
Because it creates even more uncertainty than you have.
Yeah, and people feel very overwhelmed because they're like, what we're trying to do is not working. So we feel like we are running, in a circle and going right back to square one. So I'll try to be very brief with this. The example that I have, so it was a client of mine, and I won't give their name just to protect confidentiality, but it goes back to the talent acquisition example that I gave earlier. When we think about the employee life cycle, this was an organization that had very little diversity at every level of the organization, but particularly in senior leadership, just no diversity. And, the way we define diversity is difference, at every level of the organization. So that's a very broad term. But when they began to disaggregate the data, they saw more specifically what cultural groups were not represented in the organization. And that was a problem because they were serving those communities, right? So it was this idea of we need to look like the customers that we're serving and the communities that we have a presence in, whether that's physically or even to some extent, virtual. So they one of their biggest challenges was to increase representation in the organization. And of course, there's that whole layer, as you were talking earlier, Chaba, about, it's one thing to bring them into the organization, but we know the real work comes from creating that inclusive environment and psychological safety. So we definitely addressed that. That was kind of part two. But I just wanted to stick with this change effort just around doing a better job of attracting more diverse talent. And so, and working alongside them, we looked at it both from so the ultimate goal there was, at least as a step one, was to again increase and change that talent pipeline, to have a more diverse pool of candidates coming into the organization. And so we looked at it both from a behavior and a systems change perspective. And so we laid out that entire process of recruitment, of attracting and recruiting talent, and completely turned that upside down. And one of the things that I challenged them on is when we're trying to create change and we're serious about it, we can't say can't, right? Or we can't find talent, or we can't, you have to say we have to. If we're going to thrive as an organization, and we have to attract talent, not we can't find. No, you can. We have to. So if we have to, now let's sit down and figure out how to do it. And so we just completely laid out the process, the system that they were using in terms of attracting talent. And we saw all kinds of barriers and problems, right? In terms of, again, who they were sourcing. And it was, again, the same traditional relationships that they had had for 100 years. And so we turned that upside down and expanded their sourcing channels significantly. Everything from, when you think about, they were partnering with universities, it was mostly what we call here in the US PWIs, predominantly white institutions, versus historically Black colleges and universities, or Hispanic serving. So they began to reach out and form partnerships with them and relationships with them, and wanting them to send their students their way once they were graduating, or their alumni. So completely revamped the process, the system that was in place to broaden the opportunity to make that sourcing look different, and then to make that pipeline begin to look more diverse. And then we focused on behaviors. And so there was some learning and development that they did in terms of equipping folks, in terms of, how do you attract diverse talent? How do you become more culturally intelligent in the process? How do you manage your bias? So a combination of a number of very focused efforts using data to change that system and those behaviors. They saw a significant increase in terms of not only attracting diverse talent, but actually hiring diverse talent. And again, we definitely had to, Chaba, to your point, absolutely had to make sure we were working on both ends, right? So we want to make sure that when people come, it's not a revolving door. They get inside, and the culture is so, not healthy, not safe, that they stay for a moment. And that didn't happen overnight, but we fully understood that part of the inclusion piece. But I think that was a successful change effort, just in terms of looking at it on the front end of the employee life cycle and that whole talent acquisition and recruitment. So I thought that was very successful, and it didn't happen overnight, but we used the change management framework, and so we followed those 8 steps. So not only did we look at behavior and system change, but we followed the 8 steps in terms of the buy-in, right, and how we were going to structure the work, and what was the strategy, and then how we're going to communicate that, and creating small wins. So we walked through those 8 steps, and it made a difference.
It sounds like that change is always driven by incentives, and step one is buy-in. And buy-in can happen when we create enough awareness about what's the benefit of doing it, and also what is the cost of not doing it, because often they are not aware of it. That's just when we are in this rat race, then we don't even notice it. We are just too reactive.
Yep.
And it's interesting that even during the pandemic, I read an article about this, that in 6 weeks, the world implemented 5 years worth of behavioral change. 5 years condensed into 6 weeks. because suddenly we had to work from home. We needed online courses, and companies postponed everything. Not yet, but when they had to, guess what? There were a lot of horror stories even during pandemic, but a lot of amazing stories, and people realized that they're capable of much more than they ever realized. And that's the beautiful part of it, and we cannot forget that, because you cannot get resilient when everything is fine. And change and innovation requires also some kind of pressure, just like growth. No pressure, no diamond.
I love that. I love that. And I think about, another real example, when I was with the Cultural Intelligence Center prior to relaunching my consulting firm. I was there when we were right in the middle of the pandemic, and we had some online and virtual things, but that's different from everything needing to be all of a sudden virtual. And we made that conversion in like 30 to 60 days. We did it, right? Whereas in the past, we would have probably moved a little bit slower, because we thought we had the time. So that, I think your point is incredibly true. And there were many other organizations that did that, and they were able to, stay alive and thrive. And others who did not, they were not able to survive.
And for me, very similarly. So I've had a couple of examples actually where change process or the transformation, I'll say, went very, very well. And one of them was actually in the middle of the pandemic. Very similar to what you both already, talked about. Kind of, I think what Csaba, you said, where years of change management and all of this work got done within, overnight, pretty much. So I was part of one of those projects that was kind of like leading part-time. It was technology, it was kind of like a sidekick. And when the pandemic happened, then that became the most urgent priority project in the whole organization. And well, thankfully, I had been working on it for probably the past kind of like 12 months, and I had good relationships with the suppliers and stuff to be able to switch it quickly, to put the trainings in place, for people to have a relatively smooth transition. But actually, the example of transformation that was I don't want to say it was even bigger than that, but it wasn't just to do with technology and kind of like people behavior change in this context, but it was when we were building out in one of my previous workplaces, when we were building out one of the departments, we were doubling it in size. And so because the work was kind of like threefold work that they had experienced before, and so the team was relatively small, too small for the work that needed to be delivered, overwhelmed, overworked. And now suddenly within a relatively short period of time, we needed to double that department. So I'm talking about hiring about 200 people inside that department. So it's a huge department. And I remember I was working very closely with the CIO at the time. And the first thing that we kind of like got together, and I said, you know what? This will change. This will completely change the whole culture of this department. And so now when we are at square one, we have the opportunity and the privilege in a way to create that culture by design as these people come in, rather than hiring all these people. Everything is frantic, things are being thrown at walls and stuff, and then suddenly when the dust settles, you realize what the hell we have created here, because this culture has suddenly grown extra arms, legs, heads, and all kinds of things. And now our full-time job becomes, how do we chop them off? And that's much harder than thinking about how do we implement that stuff at the very, very beginning. And so, and I will, without going into kind of like too much details, I'll say that the key success factor, what made it successful, was the fact that the CIO was the absolute face of that transition, not necessarily transition, of that transformation, of that change piece. He was engaged, he was present. Everyone was overworked. He was present whenever we were delivering any and preparing the rest of the department that was already there for the changes to come, and being very transparent with them and saying, the culture here will change. We are at square one. Let's design it together. So everyone was involved in it. Everyone had a say in it. And we, designed the process in the process of that. But the key fact that the leader, the CIO, was at the forefront of it was the absolute key success factor. And actually now, as I say that, I also remember the white paper that I launched last year with my colleagues at the Oxygen, was that, when it comes to employee engagement and employee attendance, and we talked in a slightly different context, but I think it just as well works in this context, is that when it comes to, webinars and trainings and this and that and the other, the attendance rates and engagement rates were relatively low. But the key differentiator, again, what really took those engagement rates through the roof and to kind of like 95%, was the fact that one of the C-level, the CEO or the leadership was present, were engaged, were championing those topics or those initiatives, and that and I have seen that in real life of how that works and plays out in such complex and messy topics as change, people change can be. So yeah, the leadership involvement, commitment is huge. And I know, Sandra, you talk a lot about that also as part of your book, where there has to be commitment from the top when it comes to these things.
Absolutely. There's no way around it. And I tell organizations, they say, well, what if we don't have it? Do we just not do anything? No, I'm not suggesting that. You do what you can, but just realize the consequence is that you're not going to have the level of change and impact that you want or could have. Yeah, great. I think that's a great point.
Wow. And look, the hour, and just like that, the hour is gone again. Well, thank you both so much for this highly, and hugely insightful conversation, for sharing your views, your experiences. I definitely have learned a thing or two, and hopefully the people who have been here with us as well have found it insightful and useful. And those who might be watching us on replay, again, the comment section, though won't be live anymore, it will still be monitored. We'll be still notified for any new comments. So feel free to share your thoughts at any point when you might be watching this session. But thank you all for joining us. I did see that we had people from London, we had people from Houston, Texas, and Oregon in the US. So we had people from all parts of the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this hour with us. And yeah, really looking forward to the next session. I'm sure it will come. Thank you both.
Thank you.
So much.